Hi, I'm John Cuddeback.
And I'm Sofia Cuddeback.
If you're wondering whether you can really be friends with your spouse
and raise children into responsible adults with whom you have a relationship
and do what it takes to make a homestead, reconnecting with your body and the land wherever you live.
If you just want to think more about how to make a truly happy home in our trying times,
then the Intentional Household, a LifeCraft podcast, is for you. Join us. Welcome, everybody. Always great to have this opportunity to have a great conversation with my wife. Today, self-care, integral but elusive in the household. So what brought this to our attention, dear?
A good friend of ours who is a listener on the podcast said, I'd love it if you could just talk about self-care. A good friend of mine, mom of 5 kids, really lovely family. And she said, can you talk about self-care? And that really resonated with me. I thought, that's a great topic. That, in any case, this is going to be interesting discussing it with you because I think it involves something completely different. Like it might strike something completely different in you as the man of the household than it does in me as the woman of the household. But immediately, as soon as she said that, I thought, oh yeah, that has been a tough one to figure out and negotiate our entire household career up to now. So I thought,
it has.
I think that will be a good conversation.
Good. I agree. And I have to say, it's not something that some of the other things that we talk about here, we've talked about a lot already ourselves. This is something we haven't talked about so much directly as a topic, but it certainly is in the background, at least, of a lot of things that are going on. So I hope in our conversation here, we'll be able to maybe offer a new approach, maybe a deeper, a little bit more principled approach to self-care. Point out how important it is, consider how important it is in the household, make some distinctions between how it's different for men and women, and indeed might often lead to some issues there, maybe some conflict, a lack of understanding, and maybe each needs to grow in understanding. There's always that aspect in marriage of how can we understand our spouse better. We've talked about the principle. We need to learn the difference. We need to love the difference. We need to live the difference between man and woman. And I think self-care is going to bring out that that we have different needs, and we also tend to have a different approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Different challenges in actually getting it done.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's going to be real time.
So should we begin by making some distinctions about what we're talking about when we say self-care? I mean, obviously there's something that people normally hear. What do you think people normally hear when they hear the topic self-care? What is going to immediately jump to people's mind?
Well, first of all, because we're at the beginning of the new year, I mean, I think that's part of the reason that when our friend requested that we talk about this, I thought, perfect timing, because we're all thinking about what can we do for the new year? And usually New Year's resolutions involve some kind of commitment to a new form of exercise or diet or so. So self-care, I think, very often immediately conjures up images of ways of caring for the body, which is, of course, part of it. That's one of the first things that comes up to me is self-care is, taking care to be more healthy.
Which I think that is the common usage, and it makes sense. And this, we're not going to say, well, this is a bad usage, right?
No,
I think we're going to say that's key, and we already can get maybe a deeper view into how important bodily self-care is by thinking about our relationships in the household and how our bodily health is exceedingly important in the big picture of doing this thing called household.
Yeah.
But probably also here, maybe we step back and take that kind of broader view of other aspects of self-care that are not bodily.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's super important. I just want to back up for a second and just say, I think part of what might be unique about this conversation or discussion is that we're talking about it specifically in the context of the household. And so this is a little bit to zoom out and kind of before we start talking about the particulars.
I like zooming out.
I think part of the reason it's worthwhile to really kind of underscore that we're talking about in the context of the household is, first of all, there are very specific challenges that are presented to self-care by being a member of a household. You're not just kind of deciding in a vacuum, what do I need right now to feel better? There are all kinds of other considerations that kind of kind of weigh in on that question. And I think that's very important. And I think that's part of where some of the challenge comes in the way people think about self-care. If you are living in a household, I think it's very important to be aware that the question of self-care is in a larger context.
Right.
Because that's going to be very often you talk about domestic prudence, practical prudence. I think this is very operative in the whole question of how are we going to consider the question of self-care? Because there's so many other things involved. I mean, ultimately, I want to say self-care is about flourishing, about being the best you, the healthiest you. If you are married and you're living in the context of a household, if you exclude the considerations of the household, you're going to fail from the very beginning. Because for us, being our best self is flourishing within the context of the household, in relationships with our spouse, with our children, with our physical environment. And if we exclude any of those things in the way we approach self-care, it's like cutting off a limb. And so I just wanted to just say that right away from the beginning, first of all, because I feel like it's going to drive some of our questions, like how do we approach this? And it will help us understand that there are certain parameters that actually make it easier to come up with an answer to our particular struggle.
Well, I love that point. I want to push it a little further. Right off the bat, I want to say, it seems to me that self-care is both harder and more important in the household than if I weren't considering myself as part of a household. And this isn't to say that people who aren't married in a household, self-care somehow is easy or not important. But I think as we'll come out here as we think about this, both mothers and fathers, particularly if they're in the context of raising children, especially young children, well, then again, not just young children, any children, it's going to be so demanding. We're going to start to see here how this tends to lead parents to neglect themselves because it's life is just so very demanding right now. Well, that's one aspect in which it's going to be more difficult. But then this aspect of it being taking on a new importance. I'm not going to say necessarily more important than someone in a different situation, but there is an absolute added importance that's beyond just what you would see in all the self-help magazines of, be your best self. But I need to be able to serve well those around me. And being in a household is very much always a matter of service to my spouse, first of all, and service to the children. And I mean, that to me, especially as a man, is going to say, what's going to most move me to actually take the time to take care of myself is going to be the principle that it's going to empower me to better serve my wife and children. Okay. Now, because I'll just say it now, I think a lot of men, especially, will kind of have a sense of, I'll be fine. Self-care is just kind of, that's almost for weaker people. I'm fine. I'm healthy. Don't worry about me. Everything's going to be fine over here. Meanwhile, I'm missing certain things that I need for my personal flourishing, but I actually need if I'm going to be able to take care of others the way I need to. So I just think that's drawing out a little your point of it's kind of raises the ante in the context of the household.
Well, I just have to add something to that. This is, I guess, what happens with real-time discussion. We're going back and forth here. But I do think it's true to say that our motivation for self-care within the household is so that we can better fulfill our service of others in the household. That is 100% true. I think it's an extraordinary thing within a household that when that is done well, it's not a separate track from caring for yourself. That the service of others in the context of the household is actually a way of you taking care of yourself. So I, because I'm afraid that if you just say, well, the most important reason for self-care is so that we can take care of others better, we miss the self in self-care.
Okay.
And I think it's important that be present there, especially in the context of a household. I'm speaking from the perspective of the mother, especially of a young family. There's so much pouring out of self for others that often there's this depletion that happens. And it feels right to do that because this is what the people you love need. But there has to be a way in which you are always present in that action or environment. If it's a pouring out where it's a one-way street, you're always just looking outward. What do other people need? And to the exclusion of an awareness of yourself, there's going to be a problem. And ultimately you won't be able to serve your family. And so I just want to say, I think that what you're saying is true and correct. It is true that when we have true self-care, we're able to give to others better what we want to do for them. But it's not like two separate tracks.
That's a great point.
That true self-care for the sake of others includes your own flourishing and good. And I think that's important because I think we lose track of that. We lose sight of that as mothers, that somehow it's just, well, as long as they're flourishing, as long as they're flourishing. No, that's not real self-care. You need to be also flourishing as well.
Well, I very timely, I think very, very important intervention. And let me say back what I'm hearing, what I'm thinking when you say that from my side, that I love the point of it's not two tracks. Somehow it's the same reality of kind of my vocation, the thing that I do in the household, in these relationships. This is me. This is where my flourishing will be, and the flourishing is very integral. It's very whole. And so the way I said it earlier could be taken as, in any case, too one-sided of just, it's always about them. And I have to take care of myself more simply so I can take care of them better. I see your point. There's something more beautifully whole of this, in a sense, is who I'm called to be. This, in a sense, is my flourishing, that I'm taking care of them. But part and parcel of this is how I take care of myself. Mm-hmm. And there's not a conflict here. There's a wholeness, even if there's a kind of two-ness. I mean, we kind of look back and forth. I mean, for instance, I want to say the principle: you can't give what you don't have. Mm-hmm. I think that's a very important principle we need to think about when we're thinking about the importance of self-care. There can definitely be a misguided, I'm just going to keep kind of driving forward and take care of them. Pardon me. But you're actually undermining your ability to give to them because you can't give what you don't have. But it's almost like this is a beautiful way that it's been designed. It's a beautiful gift of God that you can't give what you don't have. And so that assures in our striving to be givers, to be caretakers, to form others in so many ways, that demands that we not leave ourselves out. Mm-hmm. We have to be becoming a certain kind of person, a kind of person that God wants us to be becoming anyway.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of as you're saying that, I'm thinking about it not being two separate tracks, being one track. In the context of marriage, I wonder if one of the ways that self-care can really work without in any way compromising your outward gaze toward your spouse or your children is maybe your spouse safeguards your self-care, in the sense that one of the ways that you can keep looking outward, what do my children need? What do my husband need? What does my husband need? Is when the husband's looking at his wife and saying, and what do you need? And I think you're going to need this. Let me help you do this so that your needs are taken care of. Yes, because otherwise right. I find for myself psychologically that, I'm outward, I'm toward the family, I'm toward the children. I'm always giving, what do they need? What do they need? What do they need? It's hard for me to be doing that. And at the same time going, what do I need? What do I need? And sometimes I realize, I need to ask myself, what do I need? And then when I start looking, what do I need? I lose sight of my family. So it's not, maybe I could be better at doing that, but I just wonder to what extent spouses can be a help to one another in being able to maintain their outward gaze for the good of the members of the family by saying to your spouse, sweetheart, I think you need a little bit more physical exercise. Let's make time for you to go to the gym. Or how can we, help you be able to have the mental space to do that? So it just all of a sudden struck me in the context of marriage. Yes. I think that's going to be a very important part of success and self-care.
Well, I want to up the ante. I think that you've just touched on one of the most fundamental reasons why in God's design, there's two parents, there's two spouses, there's two parents. It is that we need one another to be looking out for one another, precisely when it comes to that, especially the arduous aspect of raising children, where each of us, if we're to the extent often that we're succeeding in a very important part of what we need to be doing, namely looking outward, being unselfish, looking towards them, um, a mistake in judgment can happen. We can miss, how important it is as part and parcel of this to be taking care of ourselves. And a safeguard against that is the spouse. But I'm really glad that we're kind of really have hit upon this here early on in this discussion, because that's a great reminder to me right off the bat. I was thinking to myself and thinking about self-care. I'm going to want to say to myself, say to others, I too often forget to think about myself. I too often forget to think of the importance of my own self-care. It's just struck me. And so I need to be intentional about that. I also need to be intentional about looking to you
Mm-hmm.
and saying, you're forgetting yourself, dear. Here's how you're forgetting yourself. Let me help you remember yourself here.
Mm-hmm.
Let me encourage you in your self-care. And what also strikes me about that is, to the extent that I neglect myself, I'm probably also neglecting you.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if I'm not properly prioritizing, hey, I need to make sure I'm taking care of myself, I'm probably also neglecting that in you and also projecting to you, this is what I expect. Like this,
Mm-hmm.
this is the standard that you run yourself into the ground. No, that shouldn't be
Yeah,
the
that's true.
standard that you run yourself into the ground. I together we look at one another and we take care of one another, and and it's a better, fuller way of being generous towards the children. Always so easy to forget this. Indeed, we've talked about this, we've thought about, we've prayed about, we've recognized how we've made mistakes. Especially I've made mistakes of too often just kind of assuming you're okay, and well, what about the children? Assume my spouse is okay, but what about the children? No, that's not even the best way to take care of the children.
Mm-hmm.
It's always best for them they look to you first.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just is really striking. This whole notion of self-care it's about all of us.
Mm-hmm.
And especially I'm going to be called to help you take care of yourself.
Yeah. And I feel like another opportunity that this approach might give, which is very exciting for me to think about, um, what you need in your self-care is very different for what I need as a woman. And what I need is maybe not that clear to me, but in some ways it's more accessible for me to find out. And I have to say, in some respect, it's always a little bit of a head scratcher to me about men and what they need. And it's just so different from what I need. And it's actually a beautiful opportunity for me to look at you and say, well, what does John need to flourish? I mean, I tend to take care of you, feeding, thinking about, oh, well,
Yes,
maybe
you
this
do.
supplement you need, maybe that. And we talk about different, healthy things that we do, et cetera. But that's very different from me looking at you and saying, what does John as a man need to flourish? And kind of more in terms of thinking less about this or that particular thing, but more, I know that I need this in order to feel well and be physically well and psychologically and emotionally well, but maybe it's a little bit different for John. I wonder what he needs. Just asking that question is an invitation to grow in relationship. And
Good
so maybe
point.
if we look at it that way, that it's going to take a bit of imaginative creativity on your part to really be able to understand what I need, because it's not going to be immediately apparent to you because your needs are so different from mine. And honestly, the thought of you taking that time of scrutiny of who I am and what I might need as different from you
Right.
just makes me so happy, thinking, wow, I'm being seen.
Right.
And so,
And it's all about being seen and
yeah,
seeing and feeling seen.
yeah.
That's what our relationship is about.
Okay, wow. So this has taken a totally different
Wow.
turn than we were expecting. We were going to talk about self-care, but I think it's a very important
I mean, it's totally
foundation.
different. It sure is. And I'm even inclined, ultimately, I think we want to say that there's a kind of spiritual, psychological, and bodily.
Sure.
And I think we should consider briefly each of them. But right now, I just think one more kind of overarching, which is key to all of them, that just fits here is the ongoing issue of I think among many conscientious spouses and parents, there's this aspect of, oh, I'll be fine.
Mhm.
And I think we need to look that straight in the eye and think a little bit about why is that happening and what do we have to do to overcome it. Right?
Mhm.
I mean, I know I see that in myself, and I think in a different way I see that in you. But so, well, this as I'll be fine in my bodily health, or when I'm going to go ahead I'm going to go ahead and mention one right now. Um, that is in the psychological realm. I was recently at a Seek conference, it's called, and I met a man whose name is Daniel Miola, and he has started a group that is a ministry for the adult children of divorce. It's called Life Giving Wounds. But it was so great to meet him. He gave me his book by that same name. I started to read it, and I was so moved. And the bottom line there was, it there's a lot of help due to perhaps trauma, suffering of various kinds of the children now who have grown up in a family where there was divorce. And just the reason I'm mentioning this is one of the most striking things was very often they feel as though, or have even been told that, quote, they'll be fine. And they don't, they don't need to kind of necessarily seek any help or kind of companionship in the sorrow to kind of work these things through. And that's a big part of, first of all, reaching out to these people, from what I gather, is I'm blessed to not be in that situation, though it was shocking, that perhaps not shocking, the statistics of how many people in growing numbers are the children of a divorce. And this is just an example where we can totally see someone saying, see if that person's now married and in the throes of family life, I don't have time now to worry about my own wounds, my own past, and we just soldier on. I think this is a great example of where this is a problem. A real part of self-care is going to be recognizing I'm hurting, I'm hurt, I need some assistance. I need someone to kind of go on this journey. I need some understanding. I need to be seen. Whatever exactly it is, there we tend to, maybe in a very well-intentioned way, say, "No, I'm not going to take care of myself in that
Mhm.
way."
Or I
But
can't, or maybe
or I
I
can't.
don't need to.
Right.
So, yeah.
So in any case, why is it that so often, and you see that in me, when you tell me that I need something, I often just kind of shrug it off. Why do I do that?
That's a good question. I think I think sometimes it's hard for us to encounter the self. And it's a little bit feeling like the demand is to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps.
Hmm.
Well, I mean, if I'm wounded, that means I don't have the hardware. So how am I supposed to get better? So sometimes it's just overwhelming that this the self-care, I think, is a call to have to reach out outside yourself to something.
Hmm.
Whether it's to God in the spiritual life or to a counselor or something equivalent of that in your
Mm-hmm.
psychological and
Mm-hmm.
emotional health, or to a fitness program or a trampoline or whatever it is that you need, particularly for your physical need. When you lack in a particular area, to step forward to do exactly the thing that's going to make you stronger. You feel like, oh, I don't have the hardware to do the thing that's going to make me stronger.
Okay. Well, then, what was the obvious common thread in all three of those is they're hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to start an exercise program. It's hard to reach out for psychological help.
Mm-hmm.
In the spiritual area, it takes discipline. I'm going to have to come up with these particular steps. So it seems perhaps one of the very kind of simple, right there before our eyes, reason that self-care is difficult is there's two factors come together that's kind of a, as it were, deadly combination. That sense of, hey, kind of a good factor, I need to attend to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And I just doesn't seem like I really have time for this. When you then shake into that, the second factor of it's actually going to be really hard to do this,
Mm-hmm.
and then I think together it's pretty obvious why I don't
Mm-hmm.
do it, and it's and again little bit of a toxic combination that maybe we aren't we good at hiding from ourselves our own motives. So very often we're going, oh, I don't need that, I don't have to do that. We're not meaning to be kind of selfish or lazy, but in fact, what we might be, and I certainly can say this from my own experience. I can feel it right now, looking back on times where you've said, "Well, John, I just think you need to this or you need to that." I more allow myself to focus on no, you know, throw in the third factor. I'm not completely convinced, maybe that I do. So I'm not completely convinced that I do. I'm busy having to take care of other people and important things. And by the way, it's going to be hard to do that. There's kind of a trio of, no, I'm just, it doesn't get prioritized in a busy life. Then it's just not going to happen.
All right. So how do we address that? What do we
Well,
do to be able to successfully begin to achieve some steps in self-care?
well, how about this? If something's hard to do, the a very important thing then in our having the power, the oomph to get up and go to choose it is we need to clearly understand its importance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think already we're very much on the right track here in what we've been reflecting on here, because we have started to articulate together to ourselves here that this actually is very much part of God's plan. It is part of the flourishing. It is part of actually how I take care of others, that I take care of myself. Principle, can't give what I don't have. Another philosophical principle, action follows upon being. I need to more become a certain kind of person if I'm going to be able to help bring that about in others.
Mm-hmm.
So I really think we need to recognize this. This is what God's calling us to. This is part of a natural plan. This is what my spouse needs. This is what my friends need. This is what my children need. That I take the necessary steps, both in the spiritual realm, first of all, to have the spiritual life, the interior life that I should, and in the psychological realm, what kind of care, help, assistance, therapy might I need there, and bodily too. What do I need to be doing to be in the best health, reasonably speaking, to have the strength, to have the stamina, to have the not being falling asleep? How often have I said this to my students? If you're falling asleep in class, folks, we got a problem. You're not prioritizing your health and you're getting the right amount of sleep if you're falling asleep when you need to be doing this with me. And so again, sometimes we're going to fall, we're not going to, the children are going to keep us up or whatever, but by and large, that we really do have that seriousness about those things in view of how important it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I feel like kind of what we've gotten a bit of a handle on, it's pretty clear that self-care is actually going to be something that's exceedingly important in the household, because the household is about the flourishing of its members. And the members will not be able to flourish, including yourself, if you are not attending to that.
Exactly.
So let's just talk a little bit about some practicalities,
Okay.
so what it looks like in the
Great.
household.
Well, should we start with the spiritual?
Yeah.
This is what people normally think of, but hey, we want to take a holistic approach to the person. And at the epicenter of actual flourishing is is the spiritual, is the kind of primacy of the immaterial, is of the spiritual good. And so it's also just obviously something that we need to do for ourselves that others can't do for us. And maybe this is where all of us will right off the bat recognize it's a losing proposition to say, well, I'm just too busy or I have to take care of other people, so I'm not setting aside my prayer time in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
This is a classic and understandable but very serious mistake of not taking care of what should have been taken care of or what should have been prioritized, setting aside the time to attend to the interior life, reading scripture, praying, meditating, having that time in silence,
Mm-hmm.
worship, adoration. This is, I don't think it's unfitting to call that the first heart of self-care. It will always be a mistake if I think I'm taking care of other people by minimizing the time. This robbing Peter to pay Paul is a very is just off,
Mm-hmm.
because there's the obvious principle that I will have much more to give, but even more than that, others need me to be what God is calling me to be.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's one thing that should be obvious, that's central to God's calling me to what I'm called to be, is my prioritizing the spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as believing Catholic Christians, for us to come to the spiritual life is about understanding who we are at kind of at the most fundamental level in relation to the one who's created us in love and is inviting us back in love. And so that time, that spiritual time, is really about relationship. And what relationships do for us is they tell us about someone that the person we're looking at, and that person in return tells us something about ourselves. And so in our spiritual life, that's really what we're doing, is we're growing in relationship with the one who has created us out of love. And that relationship, what it gives us, it helps us to understand ourselves better. And it's really kind of a true stance. So just like we say that whenever, if there's something about ourselves that we don't like, we don't want to see, and we kind of avoid that, it's going to be hard for us to move forward in truth, because it's always kind of a limp because we're avoiding something.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we want to avoid the limp in the most fundamental and kind of essential way in our life, in our relation to we want to understand this incredibly beautiful, life-giving relationship with the one who's created us out of love for us.
Amen. Amen.
And so if we don't, if that's a vacuum, all the other good relationships that are coming, that we're building outside of that, there will always be something of the essential fiber that's missing, that we don't,
Yes.
that we're not in touch with, that we don't know, that we don't recognize. And so we can't speak from that part of our being. And so that's why I just think the spiritual life, attending to your spiritual, you said, praying first thing in the morning, really totally these practical approaches to how we exercise things in the area of spiritual life, psychological life, and physical life really is dependent on where we are in our state in life. If the baby's been up all night and then the toddler gets up at 5:30, it's hard to find kind of, where do I find the morning quiet to encounter the Lord in Scripture? Maybe you're not doing it in the morning, but the first step is to recognize it is important for us to encounter the Lord that way.
Amen.
And so if we're not doing it in the morning, where can we help one another find time to do it at other times during the day? So
yes.
I really, want to underscore that, because it sounds like saying, if we don't start the day with Scripture, which is of course the ideal way of doing it, but sometimes we turn our gaze to the Lord and we say, I can't spend time with you right now. I'm so sorry, but I promise I'll do it a little bit later today. And in the meantime, walk with me the rest of the day. So,
and of course, absolutely, there has to be that flexibility, but it's the principle.
Realizing that it's important.
And I think here we've hit upon something that it cannot be repeated, adverted to too many times. That the household itself is an exemplification of life is about relationship, deep quality relationships, and the fundamental relationship in all of our lives is that with our Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And it is the relationship that truly grounds and gives reason and life to all our other relationships. And so to really succeed in the relationships that the household is constituted by and is about every day, then there must be that priority of the relationship, again, that grounds, gives reason, life, end, and goal to those other ones.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is central to life. This is central to the household. The household is rooted in the primacy of the relationship to someone that, I don't even want to say to someone that's outside the household, to someone who's at the heart of our household.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's why the first kind of really full sense self-care is attending to that relationship, which will never, when rightly done, be a cause for the other relationships to suffer. It
Mm-hmm.
will always improve those other ones. And the details of that we need to work out as spouses. And I, as a husband, need to be looking out for, dear, you didn't get this time in the morning. When are we going to get that time for you
Mm-hmm.
later in the day? I need to bring it up. I need to ask it. We need to be looking out for one another. Different spouses will be in different ways depending on who's getting up with the children and whatever. Are we not in a holier than thou, not in aggressive, not in a judgmental, but just we're in this together? How can we serve one another, remind one another in taking care of the primacy of that time for our relationship with the Lord in the day?
Mm-hmm. I just want to share also my practical experience as regards pursuing an intentional spiritual life is that, especially when the children were very young, it was very, very, very difficult for me to have that intentional time, either in scripture or in meditation and the way I address that is simply saying, Lord, my prayer has to be the work that I'm doing right now because this is what's demanded of me. You've given it to me and I'm doing it. And so I was trying to live my day and all the practical things I was doing with a consciousness and awareness of bringing him into it. And certainly that is a very important way of praying and being with the Lord. Now things have changed for us. Those demands of the very, very young children are not with us. And I'm able to spend more committed daily time in scripture and exegesis and meditation. And I have to say that while the other way of living is, of course, very important and we want it to be part of how we live, nothing really takes the place of intentional time, of spending time with the Lord. So while
Yeah.
all of our work should be a way of praising and loving him, it doesn't take the place of intentional gaze, interior orientation, and actually a way of like coming to know the Lord by a conversation with him. It's kind of like it doesn't work when you're saying to your spouse, well, I take care of all your bodily needs. I'm doing everything I need for you, but you never spend time to actually sit down and look at them and speak with them. And so I say that by way of encouragement that I realize now in hindsight, while it seemed completely impossible for me to take that kind of time, something was missing by not doing that.
Yeah.
And that
That's a great way of
it does
putting it.
hamper my growth and relationship with the Lord to not have taken that. So I just want to encourage listeners who, are in the same position as I was so many years ago, that it's worth trying to figure out how you can have that time of gazing at the Lord.
And I should have done more. And I mean, a spouse needs to step up, and because this is at the heart of things. This is absolutely the heart of things. Let me put a finer point on it. It's important, for instance, for a man to get time with his friends, absolutely. But there's always, we all know this. There's this judgment of particularly in these very challenging times. I think, given how we are over busy, and given we've talked about this in other contexts of the stress of how much work we have to do outside of the home, and then we want to make sure we have a certain kind of work in the home. It's so hard to have all these things come together. There's certain kinds of maybe recreation that would have been nice, that otherwise wouldn't have been bad for me to do, but that I'm just going to have to set aside in these challenging times. Am I really going to have a situation where I'm going out and playing golf when my wife doesn't have time to pray?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to put it that way,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not saying that means I could never play golf, but I'm just, these are challenging things, and we need to gird ourselves up. We need to come together as spouses and have a good conversation, rooted in principles, in a willingness to suffer with one another, for one another, and look at one another. I might have to be willing to give up certain things that otherwise I really didn't want to give up.
Mm-hmm.
At certain times of the demands of children.
Mm-hmm.
I just, that really strikes me. If my wife is finding that she doesn't have time for basic aspects of the prayer life, something must be done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's the
We're
same
gonna have to
kind
be
of
creative.
same kind of commitment on. I'm just remembering that for me at that time, it was also, oh my goodness, I don't even have time to do any of the things that I really like to do. So now I've got this 15 minutes. Oh, I'm going to give it to prayer time instead of just at least getting 15 minutes to do something that I'm, really love to do that I never get a chance to do. In a certain sense, the answer is yes. It's again, like you said, it's about recognizing what's important. That's not to say things you love to do are not important, but in time of duress, you have to do kind of a triage. And it's good to recognize what's really important. And the other thing I have to say, just when you're saying, oh, do I get to play golf? Not if my wife doesn't have a spiritual life, or I never get to do the things I like to do. It's time. It's a phase that passes. It won't be that way
Right.
forever. When you're in the middle of it, you
Yeah.
just think it's going to be like this forever. So I might as well, read my novel instead, because I'm not going to make it if I never get to do the things that I like to do. Don't worry. We're going to do our best to try to create a space for the important things where necessary. But before you know it, very quickly, that time passes and the demands on you are very different.
Yes, indeed. Let's talk about the psychological. I don't think we have to go a ton into this. I just think it's worth noting. In my experience, there are far too many people that think that getting some type of psychological therapy is for only extraordinarily weak or messed up people, or for people who don't have a spiritual life, as though if you have a spiritual life, therefore that means that you don't have to worry about getting psychological help. This is a whole topic in itself, but I just want to say we are firm believers and we have acted this way, and we don't need to go into all the details other than we're happy to share that we both have sought appropriate psychological therapy and help from it's not easy to necessarily find that people do that, but more and more there are many out there who have been trained in good principles and a good approach to the kind of art, which has a certain science also behind it, of psychology. It can be done in a way that's in accord with good philosophical and theological principles. And I again just give that example of the ministry that I've just discovered called Life Giving Wounds. That's the name of it, and especially geared towards the adult children of divorce. This is just an instance of where some of us might say, I'm going to look into this, or what else is it? It's not just children of divorce we all have wounds and hurt from our childhood. We don't want to overdo it. There's always going to be some that go off the deep end, and it's all about, oh, my parents messed up, and therefore I'm so off balance in life. How can I ever recover? That's not helpful. But there is often a truth of there's real ongoing wounds that it might be good to look into, to talk to someone about, to get some professional assistance. So there's the whole realm of kind of psychological needs, psychological deficit. This has certainly been something for us. If there's this plays into marriage, this plays into intimacy in marriage. There's so many different aspects. If someone is wounded, if there's a kind of deficit of physical affection, these are things that need to be directly reckoned with. Because just saying, oh, well, this isn't a problem, actually, it is something that's affecting me in our relationship, in how we're going about our way. And it would be negligent to not be honest and recognize that and take appropriate steps.
Yeah. It strikes me as you're saying that, and I wonder if you think this is a good way of kind of saying this. It almost seems to me that in your marriage relationship or household relationship, I'm sure this can apply to outside of your household, but because we're talking about the household right now, where there are things that are particularly hard, where you are having an issue with your spouse, or why is this so hard? That it's usually a sign that there is some kind of a psychological or emotional need that needs to be addressed. In other words, a wound, that we're crippled in that area, or one or the other of us, or maybe both of us happen to have a wound in precisely the same area that exacerbates it. And so it seems to me like maybe if you encounter that kind of difficulty where you're like, why is this so hard? It's usually a pretty good sign that there's something deeper that would be helpful to be attended to.
I think that's a great way of putting it. And it's not as though we have to have a hair trigger for, oh my gosh, this means I have a big psychological problem every time there's any little argument, which is of course not what you said. But I think the basic principle of particularly where there's an ongoing challenge, we really just seem to not be able to see eye to eye, or isn't it just common that we're feeling really misunderstood / hurt? And hey, this is part of the challenge and the beauty of working out the relationship. We have to constantly be asking ourselves, to what extent is it the case that I'm not getting something that I reasonably could expect from my spouse and want to try to articulate that?
Mm-hmm.
Versus on the flip side, to what extent am I having an unreasonable expectation
Sure.
and have, say, a particularly high need, perhaps due to certain things in my
Mm-hmm.
past that maybe right now I'm not even fully cognizant of, that's really making this be more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all calls to work through it
Yeah.
together. But
Relationship.
sometimes we do need outside help. And this goes back to
Absolutely.
your earlier principle, dear, of sometimes we just don't feel like having to open ourselves to someone outside, get
Yeah.
that intervention. Marriages often need some kind of intervention, taking intervention in the broad
Mm-hmm.
sense there, maybe in that more kind of even fulsome sense. And when it's needed, it's needed. And hey, and that's okay. We're going to
Mm-hmm.
do what it takes to get this done. This is what makes a marriage, you know, proceed and grow in strength.
Mm-hmm.
That ongoing commitment, whatever we need to do to make this right, we're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to keep an open mind about what that might mean that we need to get for one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of in the spirit of what we had said at the beginning, that self-care in the household between spouses is really about the spouse saying, what do you need? In the case of psychological health, I think the first step is to say, we all have wounds. We're all broken. We're all hurting somewhere. If we approach our spouse that way, then it's not you need help, but more you kind of hold your spouse in your hands a little bit more delicately, knowing that they're
Amen.
wounded or they're delicate. And then we can begin to start having a conversation that sometimes a lot of those needs are met simply in open, frank, humble, careful of the other conversations. And then sometimes you realize we need some outer help. And it takes a kind of humility and a holding one another gently, I think.
And that's certainly something that you've done, dear, for which I will be forever grateful. All right, let's talk about the bodily things, the things that people would have most, all of us
Associate
would
with
have been
self-care.
most thinking of
Yeah.
here. I mean, we've done a podcast already on eating and the importance of eating well. So we can make a reference to that, but just say here, this is a big part of appropriate self-care. And let's all put on our big boy pants and not the pseudo phony macho big boy pants of, well, I don't, it doesn't matter. I'm fine. It doesn't matter so much what I eat. No, it does matter what we eat. We have to have the humility. In so many cases, this comes back to a certain humility of realizing there's natural needs. There's natural needs, bodily, psychologically, spiritually. And we have to have the humility to recognize them and act according to them. God has designed us, and this becomes more clear as we go on in life, that we need to eat in a certain way. We need to drink in a certain way. We need to not drink. We need to not eat in certain ways. We need to learn it. It needs to become habitual. I take care of my body because it is a temple of God, because it is, as it were, the instrument of my soul. It is me, but it is that in which the powers of my soul are exercised. It is in that in which I signify, embody, and incarnate spiritual dispositions. These are all wonderful philosophical and theological reasons that it is appropriate I be taking the reasonable steps to have bodily health. And eating well is always the first step there. And we can't afford, and it's not fitting to be cavalier. Let's start young. If you don't start young, sooner than you think, your body is going to make you start to do it. And this is just nature. So let's get in the zone if we can sooner than later. And it makes sense. It's always better anyway. The more nutritional foods are the ones that often are the ones that are best tasting in the most important sense anyway. So that put everything that we've said up to this point and reflect on already applies to the importance of eating well. All of these
Mhm.
things have importance in the big picture.
Yeah. It's interesting when I think about bodily self-care, uh, eating is something definitely that both men and women very much have in common. But bodily self-care seems to be one of the places of self-care where there is the biggest difference between masculine need and feminine need. Now, obviously, eating, sleeping, what we drink and things like that is common to both of us, with obviously some differences. And then there are some forms of self-care that seem to be very kind of more specific for men and more specific for women. And I feel like I want to underscore that, especially as we talk about things like exercise, because men and women are designed differently bodily, and we have to respect that difference. And there are certain things that are really awesome for men that have seemed to have just kind of become, oh, well, we should all blah, 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 or, different kinds of forms of exercise or something that just become really the rage, like everybody's doing them. Well, I'm not sure that they're necessarily as good for women as they are for men. So first of all, recognizing
Yeah,
that there's a
right.
real
Good point.
difference.
Good point.
And, women may not have the same need for certain kinds of exercise that men do. And because I don't have that need, I should not dismiss the possibility that you have that need. Right.
Right. Yes. Good point.
I think physical care is actually kind of a big deal because, I'll be interested to hear your input. As a woman, I feel like physical self-care is something that really goes by the wayside for women in the press of young parenting. And I think it's important. Well, one thing I guess I want to underscore, and I'm sure it's the same for men as for women, there's certain kinds of self-care that tend more toward vanity and other kinds of self-care
Yes.
that
Good
tend
point.
more toward
Good point.
caring for the good of our body, for our sake and for the sake of those who serve us. And so I think that's very important for us to make a distinction there in
Right.
bodily self-care between the self-care of vanity and because the self-care of vanity has to go sooner than, and this is not to say that any kind of things that would seem like vanity, it might not necessarily be vanity. It might be appropriate. For example, grooming
Right.
yourself. We tend to associate that with vanity, but it's not in every respect only a vanity. There's a certain sense in which it's a kind of courtesy, and it is a real self-care in that the way you think of yourself is improved if you take
Right.
a certain amount of care for your
Let's
bodily
let's linger
appearance.
with that for a moment. I do think there's a real difference there between men and women.
Mm-hmm.
I think we have to keep appropriate balance. It's it to some extent it's more fitting that women are more. I think the overseers, which I'm not getting the word, the defenders, the promoters of appropriate kind of appearance. Men tend to more. I don't care if I run out of the house with my hair, every which direction. A woman more naturally has a sense of no, you don't do that. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that's just a stereotype. Yes, sure, there's always some men that are a little bit more like I wouldn't run out the hair with my house with my hair up
Mm-mm.
in all forms, and maybe some
Mm-mm.
women would, but nonetheless, that to recognize that um, a, a woman tends to be more attentive to grooming, and there's an appropriate way of doing it that's short of vanity. What's the appropriate way? How would you put that into words? It's more that this is fitting. It's fitting that I look a certain way. It's so fitting that I show the world I take care of myself because I'm a child of God, because I'm a human person, because it's a way of respecting them.
Mm-hmm.
That's very different than I want to get the oohs and ahs.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to draw attention to myself.
Mm-hmm.
That's vanity. The appropriate self care out a sense of a dignity and propriety is not vanity. That's good. I think very often men. I mean, this is something that we've seen between us. You're like, dear, your hair's sticking up. And I tend to think, and I mean, is that a problem in the world right now if my hair is sticking up? But I think just a certain humility will say, you know what, it's just because it's not the biggest deal, but it's part of a holistic approach of it's fitting
Mm-hmm.
that I get my hair to look what hair there is there to get it to look a little better,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a small thing but a real thing that you've encouraged me in. I think it's appropriate, and I say to men, let's sometimes our wives help us in that it's a way of showing respect, maybe even just for them. They don't want to appear in public with someone who looks like, Mr. Mountain Man who hasn't taken a shower for a week.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I understand that you, Mr. Man, who picture yourself as a mountain man who doesn't matter whether you take a shower, it wouldn't care, but maybe you should
That's
care.
not the only
And the fact
consideration.
that your
Yeah.
wife does care is perhaps enough in itself. So your wife cares, so let's prioritize this aspect of self-care. Grooming is a way of respecting ourselves and respecting others, particularly
Mm-hmm.
in an age that's become so informal. And it's so weird. In an age we're obsessed with looks, but then we're super informal and in a sense say it's about yourself. There's a better way of doing it as what's dignified, as a way of respecting self and others, that we're going to be well groomed.
Mm-hmm. And then we didn't really say very much about what is the obvious self-care, which is exercise. And I just want to say
Yeah,
in
let's.
closing, just, it's hard to fit that thing in when you're young and you have lots of demands of young parenting on you. And your body is in excellent working condition without you doing very much at all. We have discovered here that changes, and
We
and
have,
and it
haven't
is
we?
and it is an important part of aging in a way that allows you to continue participate in the life of your family and your children, is to maintain a certain physical, muscular, respiratory, circulatory health that comes from healthy, active motion, which sometimes we need to carve out an
Yes.
explicit, intentional part of our day in order to maintain that.
And
I've never been
we
able
can
to figure out why running up and down stairs doing laundry does not suffice for cardio activity. But anyway,
no,
sometimes we need to
same
make
with
a
me. We
special
need to linger on this
effort.
for a moment here as we move towards wrapping up. But um, yes, and I wondered why just going and feeding the pigs and running from my one chore to the other wasn't enough to keep me in the shape that I should be in. And maybe when I'm younger, it was. I encourage younger people to just get habits that
Habits.
will be
Yeah.
sustainable. Don't overemphasize. I mean, it's tricky, and it's different people have different needs. I think sometimes people overemphasize the kind of
Performance.
bulking up
Yeah.
performance, and people are in different places. So we don't have to judge that. I just would give the principle: sustainable good health, sustainable habits to keep our body in. I mean, what do we mean by optimal? Look, if you're a soldier, you
You're
need to
going to
be
need a little bit more.
optimal means
Yeah.
something a little different.
Sure.
And I know there's kind of a big movement among men kind of to have a soldierly aspect. Hey, we need to be ready for a fight at any time. There absolutely is something to that. As long as it doesn't go over into vanity, it doesn't. As long as it doesn't go over into a kind of overemphasizing that versus other priorities. I mean, just for instance, quickly, to protect our family, the more important sense of protecting our family these days is the spiritual, the psychological, the educational. This is the main way
Mm.
we're going to protect our family. Yes, bodily
Yeah.
protection
Is
is
real.
important and real also, but are we spending, 2 hours a day in the gym so that we're ready to protect our family physically and not attending to developing our mind and interior life in such a way that we're protecting them and forming them in the primary way? That is not meant to
Mm.
be a side-handed swipe at the kind of keeping in good manly shape for the sake of being able to be strong and even aggressive when necessary. This calls for a whole discussion in itself.
Mm-hmm.
But all things in order. The household always is about order,
Mm-hmm.
each thing in its place. But in any case, what for sure, a certain cardiovascular health, a certain kind of muscular work. I
Yeah.
mean, very simple things that
Absolutely.
I'm discovering, and I'm very grateful that I have. Using that rebounder little trampoline is a great way. 15 to 20 minutes a day, doing push-ups or doing pull-ups. And then there's ways that are more appropriate for the strength and the endurance, the health of a woman's body,
Yeah.
which is different. That's worth looking
But very
into.
important.
But we need
Yeah.
to get habits that goes along with the others as part of a holistic approach of being what God is calling us to be, so that we can have, especially the relationships, and live in that fuller life together that we're called to.
Yeah, and I just as you say that, I kind of feel like maybe a good way to wrap up all these things that we're talking about, the importance of self-care within the household. It is something that's going to be hard. It's life in the household is always a series of demands that are being thrown at us all the time, and we need to use domestic prudence to decide which ones are the ones that we're going to respond to. And so obviously self-care is going to fall into one of those
Yeah.
is exactly one of those types of demands that's put on us. I just want to say that regardless of whatever the pillars of self-care are, spiritual, psychological, or physical, that one of the greatest gifts that we're giving to our children and to others in our household when we commit to a certain amount of self-care in each of those areas is we're patterning for them that self-care is something that is important and that it is appropriate for us to carve out time to do that. And especially, in terms
Amen.
of our children, when they're watching us, prudentially figuring out to what degree each of these things is being attended to. We're patterning for them that they're going to need to make prudential decisions about how they commit their time, energy, and intention. And so I think in some ways, that's one of the most important things of committing to self-care and actually exercising it within our household is that ultimately what we're patterning to our children is this is important and that this is a way for you to grow into your full maturity, is to include
Amen.
self-care in your work.
Amen. Well, look forward to continuing with many of these things we've started here. There's always more to talk about. Great to be with you all, and we look forward to next time. Thanks for tuning in this episode of The Intentional Household. If you've enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, and leave a rating or review. If you have any topic requests, please send them to lifecraftgroup@gmail.com. For our Wednesday reflections, free courses, reading groups, and live events, please visit life-craft.org.